Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. As you know by now, Edgar Allan Poe's life was full of illness, poverty, misery, despair, and rejection. But he said that the greatest of his trials was the want of parental affection, because he'd never known his mother or his father. As we've seen on previous videos, his mother was the acclaimed actress Eliza Poe. But what of his father? We'll find out who he was and what became of it on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. So Edgar Allan Poe's father was named David Poe Jr. He's from Baltimore, came from a pretty well-known family, if not especially prosperous. His father, Edgar's grandfather, David Poe Sr., had been an honorary quartermaster general of Baltimore during the Revolutionary War and went into about $40,000 in personal debt, helping supply the Marquis de Lafayette's troops. This was never paid back. And it was actually after David Poe Sr.'s death that his widow was able to get a small pension from the government in sort of partial repayment of this. Now, David Poe Jr., he was studying to be a lawyer to help pull himself up out of poverty. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he saw on stage the beautiful young actress Eliza Hopkins. And he decided to become an actor. And he followed Eliza and her husband on their tour. And eventually, Eliza's husband died of yellow fever. Not Fredericksburg, Virginia. She continued to perform, she continued to go on stage, and David Poe followed her. And right here in Richmond, they were married at the courthouse down the street from the Poe Museum. She was 18 years old, and it was her second marriage. They didn't have a lot of money, but at least she was a talented actor. He wasn't quite so talented, but they were determined to find their way in the world and make a name for themselves. And eventually, their troupe brought them up to Boston, where they started to get some positive reviews. And that's the artifact I want to show you tonight. This is the Polyanthus. This is a periodical. This is dated 1807 up in Boston. And right here, it's full of theatrical notices. This has a notice of Poe's mother, Miss Jenny by Mrs Poe as well. The Hoyden is Mrs Poe's fort. So the Hoyden was kind of a tomboy character. She played a lot of comedies. She was good at it. And in fact, the first play they performed in Boston together was a comedy. And the Polyanthus here also reviewed that one. And Joseph T. Buckingham, who is the editor, wrote this. Morton's favorite comedy of Speed the Plow was selected for the first night's performance. The parts of Henry and Miss Blandford were filled by Mr. and Mrs. Poe from the Virginia theaters. Their first appearance in Boston. Estimating the talents of this couple by comparison, we might say the same characters have been more ably sustained on our boards. A first performance, however, does not always afford a criterion by which merit may be estimated. Mr. Poe possesses a full, manly voice of considerable extent, his utterance clear and distinct. The managers will undoubtedly find him useful, and the town a pleasing performer in the Henrys, Charles Stanleys, etc. Of the talents of Mrs. Poe, we are disposed to judge favorably. So that's overall complimentary. And Mrs. Poe continued to get better and better parts, and we can tell that because there's lots of newspapers that survive with theatrical notices who list the different performers each evening, so we can watch their careers progress. And it was while they were in Boston in 1807 that Edgar's older brother Henry was born. And Eliza Poe briefly took off for just a few weeks, and then she was right back on stage. Henry Poe was continuing to perform. But that brings us to another notice in the paper. For Mr. Poe's barn, well, we expected little satisfaction. And of course, we're not disappointed. So not the best notice I've ever heard. But further down the page, you'll see what Buckingham has to say about Poe's mother. And she's playing the part of Little Pickle. It's a young boy. She's been playing it since she was 9 years old. It's in a comedy called The Spoiled Child. And here she is. She's just given birth. She's a full-grown woman, and she's still playing this little boy. So he writes of her, Little Pickle by Mrs. Poe, with whom we may be allowed the use of a pun, was a very green little pickle. We never knew before that the spoiled child belonged to that class of beings termed hermaphroditical, as the uncouthness of his costume seemed to indicate. Those are fighting words. To David Poe, at least. As soon as he read that, David Poe showed up at Buckingham's house and challenged him to come out and face him. Buckingham, of course, cowered and stayed inside, but later wrote about this impertinent actor, David Poe, who'd shown up at his house, wanting to fight him. But they continue to perform. So you get bad reviews every once in a while. But then catastrophe happened. In fact, David Poe said it was the most awful thing that could have possibly happened to him. Edgar was born on January 19th, 1809. And by March, David Poe was visiting his rich Uncle George, trying to beg for some money. And George, fortunately, wrote a letter describing what it was like to see this thespian showing up at his doorstep. I have been somewhat troubled within the last few days by a couple Baltimoreans, connections of yours. The first mentioned gentleman did not behave so well. One evening he came out to our house, having seen one of our servants, that is, one of the two we keep. He had called me out to the door where he told me the most awful moment of his life had arrived, begged me to come and see him the next day at 11 o'clock in the mansion house, said he came not to beg, and with a tragedy stride walked off. And after I had, without reflection, promised I would call, in obedience to my promise, I went there the next day but found him not, nor did I hear of him until yesterday. So that's when David Poe wrote. And George Poe is so offended by this letter that David Poe wrote that he transcribes it in his own letter, and therefore this is the only text for a letter from David Poe we have. He surely wrote others. This is the only one we have, and this is what it says. Sir, you promised me on your honor to meet me at the mansion house on the 23rd. I promise you on my word of honor that if you will lend me $30, $20, $15, or even $10, I remit it to you immediately on my arrival in Baltimore. Be assured I will keep my promise at least as well as you did yours, and that nothing but extreme distress would have forced me to make this application. Your answer to the bearer will prove whether I have favor in your eyes or whether I am to be despised, as I understand, by a rich relation, because when a wild boar I joined a profession which I then thought and now think an honorable one, but which I would most willingly quit tomorrow if it gave satisfaction to your family, provided I could do anything else that would give bread to mine. Your politeness will no doubt induce your answer to this note from yours, etc. So he puts on the guilt trip there, and apparently George Poe just did not reply. He was so offended by this letter, he did not reply. So David Poe went back to Boston, got his family, and they soon moved to New York and continued to perform. And this is a playbill from a comedy. Everyone has his fault, and David Poe appears in the cast. He's not the lead, but he plays Mr. Placid down here. So he's 5 down from the top. So not terrible. But then the following year, we get a notice in the paper that says that Mr. Poe was unable to perform last night due to a sudden indisposition, which many people interpret as him being too drunk to perform, and that's entirely likely. He did have a reputation for being a drinker. But we also know, according to the 1810 census, that he went to debtor's prison that year. He couldn't pay off his debt and he got locked up. And then he just vanishes from the record after that. Eliza Poe continued to tour. She went to Richmond, she went to Norfolk. And about a year later, there's a notice that says that she's abandoned by her husband, she's surrounded by her children, she's in dire want. There's a letter that was written that said that Mr. and Mrs. Poe have quarreled and parted ways. But there's nothing more specific about that. I'm not even sure that Edgar Poe ever knew what happened to his father. He mentions in the same letter about that want of parental affection that his mother and father both died within weeks of each other. We don't know how he knew that or where David Poe died, if he ever got out of debtor's prison, if he died there up in New York. There was even a suggestion that he died in Norfolk, that according to one witness, Eliza and David were living in Norfolk, and that's where Rosalie Poe was born. But the timeline is so sketchy, we're not entirely certain if Poe's little sister Rosalie is David Poe's daughter. In fact, one of Poe's foster father, John Allen's letters, says that, Rosalie Poe is at least half your sister. So not a full sister there. So is this true, or is John Allen just spreading rumors because he despises Edgar so much? We just don't know. So maybe we won't know exactly what became of David Poe Jr. But what do you think? Let us know down in the comments if you have any theories. And do you think that Poe would have turned out differently if his mother and father had survived, if he'd grown up in this theatrical family instead of with the Allens? Why not let us know down in the comments that too? And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces, like this volume of the Polyanthus with notices of Poe's parents, why not support the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.